Welcome to Wiley Trade Podcast, making trade inclusive for all Americans. I'm your host, Derick Holt, partner in Wiley's International Trade Practice Group. Join us as we discuss the intersectionality between trade policy, race, and making the benefits of trade accessible to all Americans. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Jamila Thompson, Senior Advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative. She previously served as the Chief of Staff to Georgia's 5th Congressional District and Deputy Chief of Staff to the late U.S. Representative John Lewis. In addition to managing and developing the office's policy team and operations, she was directly responsible for appropriations, budget, tax, foreign affairs, voting rights, oversight, and other policy areas, including trade. I'm so excited to have you here today to discuss this important topic. Welcome, Jamila, to the Wiley Trade Podcast.
Good afternoon. I just want to thank you for taking the time, Derick. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually. I love the fact that you have this amazing and innovative podcast and forum, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. So I just want to start by talking about what is USTR doing to connect the dots to explain why a worker-centric trade policy is important to the American people.
So part of the things that's so different, right, where the approach, I think, what do they say? Insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. If we want to think about what a restoration of our economy looks like, if we want to think about how we can lift up workers and to give them hope and power and possibility, how we can think about an equitable economic recovery, we can't approach this challenge through the same lens. We can't begin with the same process. So we have to expand the voices. We have to think about the manner in which we engage completely differently. It's the reason why in October, the ambassador requested that the U.S. International Trade Commission began a two-part investigation and looking at the data that we have available and applying an intersectional lens to consider gender and race and underserved communities, veterans, when we consider our trade policy. It's also the reason why I was so excited to highlight the fact that the ITC has accepted this work, and in the next year they're going to begin to have national roundtables, symposiums, and research where we welcome the amplification of this work, the participation across the country. This is not going to be a Washington, D.C. exercise. It's a national exercise where we need to listen and to hear and to learn from workers about what their experience has been and how trade policy, and more importantly, that data that we rely upon so much, can inform better outcomes. The other space where I would just like to highlight, and this is related to, the ITC data work. As you remember, one of President Biden's first actions was to issue an executive order on racial equity. And the definition of racial equity within that executive order is so broad and so thoughtful that it captures and brings along all. And what I love that the ambassador says is just because we're expanding the table doesn't mean that we're pushing people off. You have a more informed process, you have a more robust outcome. I'd also like to highlight that also in October, we rechartered our first of our advisory committees, and the Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee, or TPAC. And that Federal Register notice is still public. We encourage, we welcome people to apply, to consider going through the process, to become cleared advisors, and to offer thoughtful, technical advice to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Why? Because the ambassador's first speech, and again, when I talk about this pivot and this interconnectivity, but also a connection of all of the dots of who we are as human beings and what the human experience is, the ambassador's first speech, again, unprecedented, was on the climate crisis. USTR, usually when we think of labor and environmental issues and trade policy, labor and environment are not at the forefront. And you hear for her very first speech to be on combating the climate crisis and sending a signal that the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative is ready, as outlined in our 2021 President's Agenda, ready, reporting for duty in the mission and the challenge of combating the climate crisis, of being able to provide the technical expertise and support for all of those other U.S. government entities who are considering and tackling different aspects of the climate crisis. That when we engage with our trading partners, that the climate crisis is at the forefront of our work. And that means that the advisors, the cleared advisors, also need to challenge themselves to think of what's in the future in terms of an equitable recovery, in terms of the impact of environmental justice, about the clean jobs of the future and how trade policy can be a part of it. But they also, another executive order that the president issued later in the year was on the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and thinking about the composition of the U.S. government. And that applies to our advisory committees, the culture of our government, how we are as stewards and as managers, and to incorporate those what we call DEI principles, the DEI Council and USTR, the DEI principles, into the way in which we charter our advisory committee. So I just wanted to flag both the ITC study, but also that recent Federal Register notice, and invite your listeners to read, to listen, to watch, to track, to apply, to join, to know that we are here, that we are ready, that we welcome your ideas, we welcome your expertise. We are more than happy to share and to educate about trade policy, but also we invite and we desperately would love to hear from you. Even if you think trade doesn't apply to you, I'm sure that it actually does. And especially if you're thinking about equity and economic recovery as from a policy perspective, now is the time.
And just wanted to say thank you, because that the ITC study that Ambassador Tai requested is going to be huge. It's going to be one of the things that when you talk about, getting the background, getting the data to figure out how do these trade agreements affect people, underserved communities, this is the way to get the information. So if you are interested, if you are an academic, there are going to be symposiums. If you are a business owner, if you are a farmer, please, please, please reach out to the International Trade Commission and be a part of the ITC study. They want to listen to you, and they want to hear your voices. You also touched a little bit about on climate. So I just wanted to ask you one quick question about it, because inclusive trade policy, it means addressing climate change and the carbon emissions crisis in a meaningful way. So does USTR have any insight on how to address climate change through trade? Generally?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In our trade policy, we have to account for the climate crisis. We have to include enforceable environmental protections in our future trade agreements. We have to, and I spoke about this a little bit earlier, we have to have environmental groups as part of the conversations with seats at the table. That's the reason why the TPAC is so important in the rechartering process. What I can say in terms of going forward is that USTR has been really forward-leaning, constructive and thoughtful in collaborating with our U.S. government entities as we work towards the same common goal of raising global standards, right? We talk about a race to the bottom when it comes to workers and worker rights. There's also a race to the bottom when it comes to environmental standards, right? And we have to, as a collective, collaborate to strengthen these standards and ensure that trade policy is not responsible for contributing to pollution and to furthering economic degradation to the maximum extent possible. So that's where and how we've been focusing our work. And we're looking forward to continuing and expanding upon that in 2022. I would just say that what is clear is when you ask about sustainability, when you ask about the climate crisis, when you ask about the intersection of trade, our posture is that it is relevant, it's a critical question, and we welcome ideas and thoughts and answers and suggestions towards what that answer might be, but also we are here, we are ready, we're reporting for duty, and time is of the essence.
Yes. You mentioned earlier about equity and what USTR is doing in terms of our trade policy. Can you just explain a little bit more about, USTR's stance on equity within trade policy?
But thank you for the question, Derick. We were really excited and challenged by the President's directives that he's issued throughout the year, and challenged in a good way, to be thoughtful and to be collaborative and to push ourselves to explore what the realm of the possible is. And I think that for those outside of government, they may not track all of the various moving pieces, right, of what equity encompasses in the equity EO. But the president, and I'm just going to run through a few of them just so that people have an idea of all of the different issues with which we're grappling when it comes to equity and trade policy within this USTR, the Biden-Harris administration's USTR, within Ambassador Catherine Tai's USTR. So the first is, I mentioned earlier, the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities throughout the federal government. That's the umbrella EO that challenges all agencies, all departments to really think through equity as it relates to gender, to race, to ethnicity, to sexual orientation and gender identity, to region, to income level. That's the big umbrella executive order. Then the president named USTR as a member of the Gender Policy Council. And the Gender Policy Council, similar to the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, the Domestic Policy Council, coordinates across government and for the White House, these key horizontal policy objectives and advances them. And we saw the oh my goodness, maybe just over a month ago, the president released the first ever national strategy on gender equity and equality. So I would like to just emphasize that this intersectional approach is not just at USTR, but also from the highest level of government down on equity and equality in that intersectional approach. Then the president also issued an executive order on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. He has an executive order on advancing equity, justice, and opportunity for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. An executive order on promoting competition in the American economy. The White House initiative on advancing educational equity, excellence, and economic opportunity for Hispanics. Presidential memoranda on tribal consultation and strengthening the nation-to-nation relationship. Another presidential memorandum on advancing the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons around the world. And he appointed USTR to serve on the White House Council on Native American Affairs. And just last week, he named Ambassador Tai as the co-chair with Secretary Becerra of the White House Initiative on Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders. That's a whole lot, and it's amazing, and it's historic, and it's dynamic. And we're working to advance equity through an intersectional approach on all of those different report streams and all of those different efforts towards the same goal. And that same goal is worker-centered inclusive trade policy. So that's a longer answer. The most recent USTR specific announcement that I'd just like to highlight, in addition to the ambassador being named as co-chair of the White House Initiative on Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders, is at the beginning of December, USTR announced that its intention to join the Joint Declaration on the Advancement of Gender Equality and Economic Empowerment within Trade in preparation for the World Trade Organization's MC12 ministerial, right? And so at every single space, you now see USTR really thinking about when it comes to equity, when it comes to lifting up all people, how can we be constructive, how can we be thoughtful, and how can we be a partner in advancing these principles, but also resulting in substantive, meaningful impacts for all workers.
Thank you. So, how did you get involved with international trade? When you first started your career, was it geared toward international trade or something else?
So it was definitely not geared towards international trade. I probably didn't do that well in my undergrad econ classes. I loved international relations and history, but my path to public service was a little bit unique. So I began as a volunteer for Congresswoman Barbara Lee in the aftermath of September 11th. As you may remember, she was the only member of Congress who cast a vote against the authorization for the use of force in the global war on terror in September 14th, 2001. And for me, as a Washingtonian Bahamian, as a supporter and proponent of peace, I wanted to support a member who was asking the question why during that really harrowing and painful time for our country and for the world, to think more thoughtfully about how we embarked on war. And so I began with her as a volunteer, as an intern. I went from being an intern to a staff assistant, not knowing that she began herself as an intern for her predecessor, the late, great Congressman Ron Bellams, and then rose to be his chief of staff before serving in the California state legislature and then eventually replacing him in Congress. So I thought I was going to work and do a little bit of my public service for a quick minute, and then, I don't know, become an academic or work in the nonprofit, move back to the Bahamas. Like, I had a whole plan, and it didn't come to fruition because she kept giving me great promotions and opportunities. And it was during that period, an unprecedented period, if you will, of trade liberalization in the early years of President Bush's administration and Ambassador Zellick, that I really got to cut my teeth, I think, at a unique time on trade policy. And trade policy, you know this better than most, similar to tax or appropriations or budget, judiciary issues, they touch on every aspect of the human experience, right? You can do anything and be part of trade. You can, and I loved it. I found it just to be exhilarating and challenging and thought-provoking, especially because of all of our work in the Western Hemisphere, right? That's when so many of our free trade agreements in the Western Hemisphere were enacted, and the conversations on the Hill, especially as what the framework of trade expanded, as it expanded, it was exciting to be a part of those conversations. And so in that work for Congresswoman Barbara Lee and the amazing experience and platform that she created to allow me to be part of member-level conversations and looking at CAFTA-DR and the Progressive Caucus and the Oman FTA and so many other bilateral, multilateral free trade agreements, and being able to ask questions about Indigenous and Afro-descendants in this paradigm at this new period. It was amazing. And so I decided that I really, really love trade. I really love budget and appropriations. I like judiciary issues. And when the opportunity came to work, when the Democrats took back the House and to work for Congressman John Lewis, whom I studied as a history major in undergrad. I was a Taylor Branch student in undergrad. And to be able to work for him on the longest standing committee in the House of Representatives, the Ways and Means Committee, it was just an opportunity beyond my wildest belief. So I get to say that I'm the only staffer, the only person who worked for the mother of the anti-war movement and the father of the nonviolence movement in Congress, and to be able to stay true to my values, but also to support their vision in that work. And so for Mr. Lewis, I handled appropriations and budget and trade, and over the years, eventually tax, and went from being his senior policy advisor to his legislative director, deputy chief of staff, and then unfortunately, when he passed away, the chief of staff for the vacant office, Georgia's 5th Congressional District.
Wow. So I just wanted to talk about a little bit about your time with the late U.S. Representative John Lewis. Can you talk about any unique examples of how international trade affected your work and the community that you served while you were the chief of staff for the late U.S. Representative John Lewis?
That's an excellent question. I don't even know where to begin because there's so many memories in the trade paradigm and the trade space. One of the aspects of our work that I thought was so unique is that he had an experience with trade liberalization and the movement of jobs from Georgia to other countries. And so he really made us and challenged us to think about the quality of work, the humanity of the people in those jobs, the standards that we're promulgating here, the competition across states, across borders, right? So we always think of international trade, but there's a competition even domestically in terms of securing investment, and what does that cocktail of incentives look like for states and the way that they attract jobs and attract investment before we even think about what crosses our borders. And so one of the more entertaining times or nightmare times is that trade markups tended to be, and Ways and Means in general markups tend to be marathon sessions. And he had about early on, he had about a 50-50 record in terms of supporting and opposing free trade agreements. We learned and we always practiced to take each agreement on the merits of the substance. But we got to the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, and it sparked a different moment for us, especially in terms of working on Afro and Indigenous peoples and the questions and the challenges of peace and human rights. And it led us to craft a resolution along with, I think a few years later in 2015, when we renewed Trade Promotion Authority, to craft a resolution that brought together civil and human rights and labor rights, and thinking about what our standards and what our aspirations should be when it came to trade policy. And it was so much fun thinking about accessibility in trade and thinking about labor and worker and human rights and women in trade policy, and advancing that conversation and pushing our colleagues within the Ways and Means committee family to always have the people present in our work. So that's a longer answer, but there were a few opportunities. And then there were some fun times where I don't think that people get to see, but trade is truly a bipartisan issue. It's a bipartisan space. And there were times where we had really great coalitions that crossed across the aisle as a state, right? The Georgia delegation, or with our Republicans on the committee, with our progressives, and we're able to find a way to hold a united front when we cross the borders on trade delegations to reinforce and to amplify what our members were saying and what our constituents were concerned about when it came to moving pieces of trade policy and trade negotiations.
Wow. And that just seems so awesome. And that experience, I know it's going to stick with you forever. So I think one thing that I want to talk about is what you actually do, right? So, many listeners may not be familiar with the type of work that you do as a senior advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative. Can you briefly describe, what you do, what a typical day looks like for you?
So I would definitely say that there is no normal day, just like a day on the Hill. It tends to be a surprise. Excuse me, my title is Senior Advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative. And it's an honor and a privilege to support Ambassador Catherine Tai, who has a clear vision in terms of worker-centered inclusive trade and setting, and the president of setting a clear goal for how to make trade policy work for more people and to fill in the details. So part of that is, of course, working with our amazing, our thoughtful, our talented career staff and technical experts within the building, coordinating across the executive offices of the president and with our other colleagues who handle trade, who work on trade issues across the U.S. government, interacting with our trading partners and building those dialogues. And then really a lot of it is thinking about what and how we can continue to deliver on the promises that we outlined in the president's 2021 agenda, and how we can build on it going forward into 2022, into 2023, into 2024. How in this brief, privileged period of time that we are able to be in these positions, to continue to think about people first, to carry the principles and that proximity that members of Congress, especially members in the House, have when it comes to trade and to workers and to business people and to fishers and farmers, and to bring that humanity into every aspect of our work. So that's a big part of my job, in addition to my specific portfolio.
And you were talking about a worker-centric trade policy. You mentioned it earlier. So I just want to touch base on that. You know, really, the Biden-Harris administration announced that, you know, worker-centric trade policy, but many Americans do not know what trade policy is, let alone a worker-centric trade policy. Can you summarize a little bit about what's the administration's worker-centric trade policy?
It's so interesting that you say that, Derick, because I think that before, maybe before COVID, you know, before the last few years, people weren't really in certain parts of the country, in certain parts of our communities may not have been connected, but since COVID, I think people have started to appreciate and understand supply chains and the quality of work and the future of work, right? From whether it's manufacturing or services, and started to connect the dots about how interconnected we are domestically in terms of production, but then also with our friends and our neighbors and workers around the world. And so at the beginning of the administration, in March, the president released the 2021 trade agenda. And the 2021 trade agenda outlined a few key priorities: tackling COVID-19 and the pandemic, our economic recovery and restoration, thinking about humans, the people who are working, the people who are producing and manufacturing and toiling so that we can have the food that we eat, the cars that we drive, the clothes that we wear, that everything that we touch has a certain standard, that the phones that we use work in a certain way, that the services that we take for granted operate and are accessible and affordable. And all of that is trade, right? Every aspect of it is trade. You know, it's everything you touch, and things that you see and you don't see. And so those were a few parts of our trade agenda. We also included for the first time advancing racial equity and supporting underserved communities, which is unprecedented. We talked about restoring our partnerships with our friends and allies and rebuilding those bridges that have been damaged and fortifying them going forward. And then thinking about what our economic growth, both here in the United States and around the world, looks like. And of course, what the ambassador says often is that we have these trade agreements, but to take them from being on the shelf to being living and active, and to using all of the tools that we work so hard to secure, and to refresh and to revisit, but to use them regularly. And so you've seen that in the last year. You've seen the ambassador the U.S. Trade Representative, rebuild our relationships with our European partners, to resolve some outstanding trade disputes, to use the tools of the historic U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the rapid response mechanism that shifts the burden away from those who would violate the rights of workers, shifts the burden to them and away from workers to prove that their rights have been violated. And we resolved this longstanding LGSK batteries dispute, that helps save the American jobs and ensure the viability of an industry that's critical in our fight against climate change. So we made promises, we outlined them in the President's 2021 agenda. We are continuing to work on them, but they're at the center of what worker-centered trade looks like. And then it's taking these ideas and putting color and voice and action and substance. And that's what we're doing going into 2022 and the remaining years.
Wow. That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you for your time. I know we're running short. So thank you for sharing your insights and your perspectives. You're doing some extremely important work. We thank you for your service, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
Derick, it has been an honor. I appreciate you. I thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to discuss these matters. We have an open door and are welcome. Would be honored to come back and to continue this discussion, because this is not a one and done for us. We're going to be doing this work every day, all day for the next 4 years, and trying to make sure that it is embedded within the heart of trade policy, that worker-centered trade, inclusive worker-centered trade that thinks of all people, of the human first, becomes the standard feature of trade going forward.
Thank you.